to another edition of Cheers to Careers. I'm Steve Ridinghouse, the Career Outreach Coordinator at the School of Journalism and Mass Communications at KU.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Cheers to Careers. I'm Steve Ridinghouse, the Career and Outreach Coordinator for the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Today we are joined by Annie Gowen, National Correspondent at the Washington Post. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I think I saw this is your 25th year with the Post, and I think you've had a variety of titles with them.
Yes. So I'm from Lawrence. I went to KU, graduated from the J School, and I basically moved out to DC and worked in a variety of sort of lower level journalism jobs. I got an internship at the Chicago Tribune, a 2-year gig there, but I always wanted to work at the Washington Post. That was my dream place. So I basically wore them down and they hired me. And first to the local staff, very low level, I was covering cops and courts, and then moved my way up. And then in 2013, I'd spent some time covering a brief period of time covering volunteering to sort of cover a summer in Iraq as the troops were leaving. And then after that, I went to India for 5 years.
So as a national correspondent, you're based in Lawrence. Now, do you have a certain geographic area you're responsible for, or how did
I'm the Midwest correspondent, so I do a lot of stuff. Obviously, I covered the abortion decision, which was such a big news-making event, and then as well. But I also cover, I've been covering a lot of stories about the threat to our democracy, current threat to our democracy, from voter fraud evangelists, from takeovers of school boards, et cetera. So I've been traveling more to do those stories. I've gone to Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, et cetera.
And are you at a point in your career where you can pitch your ideas to the editors, or do they assign you, or is it a mix of two?
Oh, so funny. Basically it's a combination of the two. So I'm on a team that they really literally called Team America, which sounds like a Marvel movie, but it's basically, they basically beefed up their staffing out in the country. So we have someone in California, we have someone in the Northeast, someone in Florida, me, and a couple people in the upper Midwest. So, we basically do respond to some news events, but we also do, basic news stories from different, whatever's happening in your region.
And I know this can vary by topic, but what makes for a good story? Can you summarize that, or what are certain details? Or
okay. That's hard. So the way I do stories, the way I like to do stories is basically scene-based narrative journalism. So those are my favorite. So for example, I just recently, I'm doing a story about this extreme drought and heat in Nebraska. And so I went out and I followed a farm family who was having to sell some of their herd because there's literally no grass in the fields. That normally that would be there because of the extreme drought. So I spent time following them. So they were culling the herd, and then they were taking them to the livestock sale, and it was very, there were dramatic scenes where there were farmers at this livestock sale that were liquidating, not the guy I was following, but there were other farmers there who had to liquidate their whole herd because there was no grass. It's too hot. They can't feed the the cattle. So those are the kinds of stories that I like to do. I really do like to sort of be embedding with people, families as they live their lives, and try to sort of gather the scenes as I go along.
And I know you have to deal with deadlines, but for a story like that, I would think you have a little bit of time to do a story, or is that kind of a quick turnaround?
With more of a scene-based story, they do give you some time to work on it. And then, of course, there's also on my, on my team, we cover hurricanes, we cover other disasters. I was in Uvalde after the terrible tragedy there. So we also do, shorter term stories as well.
I know you said you always had your vision kind of on the Washington Post. So what was your plan when you graduated? Was it always the Post, or did you know you'd have to take some steps to get there?
Well,
did you have a plan?
Yeah. So at the time when I was in the J School, there was a very there was a very prescribed path to, that you were sort of taught, which is like you start as a small paper, then you move to a larger paper, and then you move to the big leagues. And I actually didn't really want to do it that way. I didn't want to like go to a small town and my brother, my older brother, who was kind of an influence on me, he's no longer in journalism, but he was in broadcast journalism, and he did that. So he started at, a Garden City, Kansas, TV station. Then he moved to Joplin, Missouri, and then he moved to Chattanooga, and then he went to Portland, which was a much bigger market. So, he did that kind of career ladder. I just didn't want to do it that way. I didn't want to I wanted to try the East Coast. I had been to Washington as a high school student, and I really always wanted to try that. So I just sort of moved out there with some girlfriends from other KU disciplines, and we got a house, and I sort of started looking for a job from there.
Now, how early did journalism kind of spark your interest as a potential career? I mean, were you one that always read books and loved to write? I know you talked about your older brother, but I think you also have a younger brother that used to work in newspapers
yes.
and now works for Hallmark and creative writing. So are you from a family of writers?
Yes, but he got everything you knew from me. No, I'm just kidding. So my parents were writers and poets. My dad was the director of freshman, sophomore English next door here at Wesco in the 70s, and he passed away sadly in 1981. And my mom, she was a marriage and family therapist, but she wrote poetry on the side. And I always wanted to be a writer. Even when I was 10 years old, I wrote a little novel. Scribbled out a little novel. And again, my brother had, it's crazy, but he had like all these like Esquires and GQ magazines, which had that very good writing in them, So I used to read those stories. And he also had a book called Paper Lion by George Plimpton. So the book is basically like George Plimpton, going to see if he can be a Detroit Lion and working out with the Detroit Lions. And so he was embedding himself in the football team and writing about it. And that was really like one of the biggest sparks. Like I thought, how cool would it be to like sort of embed yourself in people's lives and just watch what they do. And that's kind of what I like to do now.
And during your time in college, I know we talked briefly, I think you said you spent part of a semester as an editor. I mean, how did you keep those journalistic skills, kind of develop those during your time at KU?
Oh, okay. So I was explaining that when I was here, the Kansan was a daily paper, or 5 days a week, I guess. And so it was a huge commitment of time. And I actually worked my way through college because my dad had passed away, so I couldn't commit to that time. But I did work on the Kansan as a quote unquote baby editor for a semester, like copy editing. Under John Hanna, who's now
the AP.
Very famous Associated Press correspondent in Topeka. So, yeah.
And I know, I think you touched on briefly with your time with the Post, you did work abroad. I know, 5 years as India bureau chief?
Right.
What was that experience like? Is that something that you applied for, or they said, hey, we think you can do this?
Right. So I always wanted to, I should say, I always thought that if I was going to be a foreign correspondent, like India was always the most fascinating place to me. I had an Indian writing teacher when I was living in Chicago as a young person who was very influential on me. But I had applied for the job. I was just a reporter on the local staff, and the job came open, and I applied, and they wouldn't even see me. Like the foreign editor sent his minion to take me out to coffee and say thanks, no thanks. But then I volunteered to go to Iraq for a summer, and so I went there, and based on what I did there, then when the job came around again, they actually asked me to apply for it, and so that's how that all happened.
And I know you've mentioned, I think Iraq, Afghanistan. I think you spent some time in Ukraine. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I was in Ukraine. So I was only briefly in Afghanistan, but I spent about a month in Ukraine during the first sort of friction with Russia in 2014. I have not gone this year.
And just reporting in those conflict areas, I mean, is that something you embrace? I mean, what kind of precautions did you have to take? I mean, how intense was that?
It was very intense. The Post has a huge security apparatus, so we were always mindful. We got training before we went on how to handle roadblocks, on how, what to do if you're in a situation where they're shooting. But actually, I will have to tell you that I was never as scared in any war zone than I was when I tried to cover a QAnon coffee in Texas, where the guys were kind of pushing me and threatening me. So yeah, no, being overseas was a big adventure. India was just an amazing place. You know, every story was like, you know, in the United States, sometimes basically stories are black and white. You have one side, the other side. Every story was just like an onion, and there was just so many layers to everything. You never quite finished with your reporting on anything.
And I saw on your profile you've won a few awards. Is there one that really means a lot to you? I think, have you won the Daniel Pearl Award twice?
Yeah,
reporting
that one.
Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so that one was one that was. So I won the Danny Pearl Award from the South Asian Journalists Association twice, which meant a lot because not only was it named after Danny Pearl, who was obviously the Wall Street Journal reporter that was executed, but it was the South Asian Journalists Association had voted on that, so it meant a lot that those were my peers that were South Asian. So, you know, I mean, I felt honored that they thought I had covered things ably. So that was for. I mean, the first one of those I won was for covering the Rohingya refugee crisis in 2017, and that was a big deal.
And I think I also saw you won. I have to look at this. Best American Newspaper Narrative by the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference in 2020, so a recent award for the Farm Families Hit by Trump's trade war. Was that a pretty involved story or series of stories?
So in 2019, I decided I was going to do a series about the way that the farm families were struggling. So I did 3 stories. I did a story. We spent a year following a family in Minnesota who had lost their dairy herd, and they were, you know, buffeted by all of the trade war winds, and they were trying to see how can we save our farm, how can we save our land, and that was the Krochak family. And so I myself and the photographer Ricky Cariotti spent a whole year following them. And that was, again, the immersion journalism that I prefer to do and I love to do. And then that was the main story. And then there were 2 other stories. There was a woman whose husband had been so despondent over the way the farm was going that he unfortunately ended his life. And then another dairy farmer who was struggling to pay the bills. I mean, they were just down to their last, you know, bag of rice, and she was going to a food pantry for the first time, and so I followed her to that. So that was basically the stories that I did in 2019 on the farm crisis.
So a series like that, I mean, how important is it to build that trust? I mean, they really do open up to you, right?
They do, and it's really hard, and I always appreciate that. It's hard. I mean, especially like right now, when I was doing the story, another farm story, as I mentioned earlier, about the heat and the drought impacting these farmers. You know, they're wonderful, lovely people, but they're also conservative. So I always feel grateful that they don't let the politics get in the way of welcoming me into their lives and showing me, you know, the hard work that they do that sort of keeps this country going. This keeps our, you know, food supply going and all that kind of stuff. So I was really gratified in all of the cases that that the families, you know, welcomed me into their lives.
What advice would you have for the graduating seniors? And we're a few months away from the class of 23. I mean, the ones who want to do what you do or just write for a career. I mean, do you have any tips on what they should be doing right now?
Yeah, so I think that you have to, one of the most important things if you're going to be writing is to refill the well. So you need to be reading, you know, really good journalism, and that means like the good long form journalism, you know, following Sunday long reads, you know, subscribing to the New Yorker, you know, reading the Atlantic. I'm sure that they all get it. They get it through they get subscriptions through the library, right? You know, reading the big New York Times magazine takeouts, you know, the Post. So I think that, you know, reading is really important, but the fiction is important too, because there's so much more kind of leeway that the fiction writers have with their wordplay that, you know, that it's good to soak that in as well. I also think in this day and age, you don't necessarily have to be hewn to that traditional career path that I mentioned earlier that was once the template. You know, I'm This sounds crazy, but I've been sort of falling down rabbit holes in TikTok lately, and I'm not saying they should all do TikToks, but I'm just saying that there's so many more ways to get your stories out there. Yeah. You know, there was one TikTok I saw where this woman just basically wrote and illustrated a children's book on her own, you know, just by sort of doing different, you know, with her different websites and et cetera, and then it was like a top seller on Amazon. So I think there's a lot of ways. If you have an idea, if you want to, you know, if you want to create certain content, if you have an issue area, I was just also a big fan of Anna Wolf, who's this young reporter who, she's living in Mississippi. She works for Mississippi Today, but she was the one who exposed this big Brett Favre welfare scandal. And she's, you know, a young reporter. She's sort of stationary in Mississippi, Jackson. But she, you know, and she's sort of carved out her niche. She's won all kinds of investigative awards, and in this sort of smaller town because she's worried about poverty and equity access and all those kinds of things. So I don't think you necessarily have to be in Washington or be in New York or be in LA to sort of like do great journalism.
No, well said. Annie, I appreciate your time. And yeah, I just want to give you a toast, a cheers to your 25 years at the Post.
Thanks.
Thanks for being here.
Rock Talk.